what GDP is. So GDP is the money value of all final goods and services produced in the domestic territory in a financial year by the normal residents. Now this GDP, we know that we have to subtract depreciation from GDP to get to NDP. NDP is the net form of GDP. It is the net form of GDP. It is the net form of GDP. This gross domestic product, by this gross we mean the total production. By this gross we mean the total production that is happening in the country. And by this net, we actually subtract something from the gross. We actually have to subtract something from the gross to get to net value. You will have to remember the concept. Whenever something is subtracted from gross, precisely depreciation, we will get to the net value of the domestic production. Now we have gotten the NDP, and NDP is the net domestic product. Net domestic product. Okay. Now, yesterday I told you that this depreciation is accounted for annually. This depreciation is accounted for annually, and always every year something is subtracted from GDP. Something is subtracted from GDP to get to NDP. Okay. Now the question is, using this as your example or as your guide, is there any possibility that NDP would be equal to GDP or NDP would be more than GDP? Is there any possibility of NDP being more than GDP? Come on. NDP being more than GDP. Okay, let me answer this. Production, the purpose of production can be of two kinds. One is the instant consumption, and the other is the periodic consumption. We have already discussed that. And I told you, when you have a periodic consumption, when you have the capital goods, when you have created a capital good, for example, you have created a machine, and there is no way that this machine is going to be perfectly fine for each and every year of its existence. There is no way that can happen. We know that capital goods are bound to have depreciation. There is no way that you can get depreciation down to zero. You cannot make depreciation zero. However, you can decrease depreciation. Say, for example, depreciation was 50%. You can decrease it by ball bearing, by say, for example, lubrication. You can actually decrease this depreciation from 50% to 10% or to 5%, but you cannot bring it down to 0%. That is impossible. Depreciation can never be zero. Fine. Therefore, there is no concept like NDP being equal to GDP. This cannot happen. NDP will be never equal to GDP. Always we have to subtract something from the GDP to get NDP. Therefore, NDP is always less than GDP. NDP is always less than GDP. There is no case, there is no event in which NDP can be equal to or more than GDP. Fine. There might be a hypothetical example when depreciation will be zero, then there can be hypothetically that NDP might come equal to GDP, but that is when depreciation will be zero. There is no you cannot even imagine NDP being more than GDP. Fine, that is something which is impossible. NDP can never be equal to more than GDP. And even in practical sense, NDP cannot be equal to GDP. Why? Because depreciation can never be zero. Therefore, we have concluded that NDP will always be less than GDP, because depreciation can be lowered, but it can never be zero. It can never be zero. There will always be some kind of depreciation.